about to get started. I just wanted to just make a few, I'm just here to just kind of say hello and turn things over to Professor Kendall Thomas, who will be moderating the session. But I just want to thank our speakers and, just say a welcome from the Institute for Latin American Studies. I also wanted to just thank others involved in this initiative. The Center for Study of Ethnicity and Race, CSER, at Columbia University, and also the Center for Law and Culture. This is a part of a new series. This is part of a new series we started this year called Afro-Americas in Dialogue. The idea is to kind of create opportunities for hemispheric discussions about issues of race involving Brazil, the US, Peru, Colombia, Cuba, the whole region as a whole. Each talk has a different focus and a different sort of mix of folks and topics to cover. But the idea is that we're kind of creating the space to have these interesting discussions. And this is our second session. We're going to be talking about sort of race and politics and religion. We have a speaker from the US and a speaker from Brazil. I want to thank Kendall Thomas, who's professor at the law school and really the spark for this particular conversation and the sort of curator for it. And it's wonderful to have you here, Kendall. It's wonderful to have Romilso and Joseph participating in this discussion. I just want to make a quick plug before I turn it over to Kendall. Just for our next session, I'll just kind of show a flyer over here. I don't know if it's showing up. Sorry. So we're going to have another discussion in a few weeks about. Are you guys able to see the?
We are seeing it. Tuesday, February 23rd at 2 p.m.
Perfect. Yeah. So we're going to have a talk about police violence and comparative perspective. So I hope those of you that are here will also join us for that conversation. And if you're interested in anything going on at the Institute of Latin American Studies, just please visit our social media or our website, and you can find information about future events. So I'll be quiet now, and I'll turn it over to Kendall and to our experts for a fascinating discussion about the role of religion in politics in the contemporary world. And I think there's a lot of interesting similarities and divergences, both in the Brazilian context and the US, both politically, racially, and religiously. So thank you, Kendall. Thank you, guys. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. It's really great to be in a virtual room with two friends, brothers and colleagues, one of whom I've known here at Columbia for many years, Professor Joseph Soret, and the other whom I met last year when we were in conversation on a panel on race and racial justice in Brazil and the US, Ronilson Pacheco. And it is wonderful as well that we are talking about these questions at this particular moment regarding difference and inequality in the Americas. In talking, though, about the Afro-Americas, we're focusing not just hemispherically, but also globally. And I want to introduce this concept diasporically, because one of the things that the last couple of years has impressed upon the consciousness of anyone who cares to look is that spiritual and religious life and the intersection of spiritual, religious life and politics in the Afro-Americas is connected to realities of the same kind in many different other parts of the world where people of African descent live, believe, and struggle in social justice movements. So our hope this afternoon is to have a wide-ranging comparative discussion of a number of issues: the role of religion in the public square, the weaponization of evangelical Christianity as a political tool by white Christian nationalists in the US or by the bancada Evangélica in Brazil, left and progressive Christian social justice practices and movements, the relationship between social justice activism and faith communities, and the rise of new Black secular social justice movements, such as Black Lives Matter in the US and Brazil, the attacks on and resistance from traditional Afro-Brazilian spiritual and religious communities, the role of political theology and religious activism around issues of racism and poverty, racism and anti-Black violence, and the gender and sexuality politics of Black social justice movements that are rooted in faith communities. The urgency of these questions is clear given the rise, the extraordinary rise of extreme right policies and ultra-conservative governments in the US and Brazil. The departure of Mr. Trump from the White House ought not blind those of us who live in America to the force, focus, and breadth of right-wing white supremacist evangelical Christianity and the mobilization of churches that embrace white supremacy and ultra-conservative politics in the US. At the same time, the counter movements reflected in the United States, for example, by Reverend Raphael Warnock's election to the US Senate, to the work in Brazil of the Movimento Negro Evangélico, suggests that the terrain of religion, race, and politics is and will continue to be contested. And we wanted in this conversation to explore the histories and contemporary dynamics of religion, race, and freedom in Brazil and the US, touching not only upon the commonalities, but on the differences and interrelations among Afro-descendent religiosities and political struggles in the Americas, and the connections between those struggles and similar struggles that are happening even as we speak on the continent of Africa. So it is my great good pleasure to open the floor to Joseph and Renilson, who will speak in whatever order they've decided for 7 to 10 minutes, and then we will spend the balance of our time in conversation. But I think since we're hosting this in New York, I'm going to ask Joseph to go first, if he doesn't mind.
Thank you. I think we were going to ask you to decide for us, Kendall, one way or another, because we had not decided.
Okay.
Way to read the moment, and thank you so much, I guess, for setting up this conversation. I very briefly, I want to thank our sponsor and Gustavo for the invitation and for setting the stage, and as well as Gabriel, who I know is working behind the scenes on the series and this event, for helping to bring us together. I wanted to offer an additional thank you to Kendall, who has, in addition to being a colleague and friend in the neighborhood, has been a longtime advisor of a small center within Black Studies here at Columbia, working at the intersections of religion and sexuality in the context of Black life. And for some time, he and I had been talking about, in light of his own work in Brazil for many years, about how to have conversations within the context of Black theology in a transnational context. So even as this event came together, I feel like it's something that he called on for some time. So thank you, Kendall, for facilitating that, and then for framing this conversation, and for indeed introducing me to Renilson a few months ago. And we had a chance to talk a few months ago, and to I think take that conversation to the next step today. So I feel fortunate to be here for this conversation. I will try to keep my remarks brief in anticipation really of a conversation and from learning from Renilson. And I have I guess three kinds of things that I want to say very quickly. I think first about part of what Professor Thomas has already laid out about thinking about not just the nation, or a transnational frame or a hemispheric frame in the Americas, in the diaspora. And that's simply to say, first, that there's arguably nothing, more definitive to thinking about not just the Black experience in the diaspora or the nation or the Americas, but in fact, right, this thing that we refer to as modernity, then religion, right? And whatever the language of religion is meant to conjure as an identity, as an institution, as a discursive frame, that nothing arguably is more central to the making and mapping of the modern world's, the America's modernity, than the phenomena lumped under the category of religion. And so when we're thinking about religion, we're not just talking about a set of identities, I am this, and you are that, or ideas, a set of theologies and doctrines or institutions and practices, but we're talking about, right, a contested set of terrains, right? An old term by Mary Louise Pratt, a contact zone, right? We're talking about all of those things, ideas, identities, institutions, and practices. And so religion is both a marker and a mediator of social, cultural, and political difference, whether within the context of a specific tradition or place or across a variety of traditions. And certainly in the context, if we're thinking Brazil and US, and my own work is grounded primarily in the context of the US, right? The lion's share of attention is usually given to Christianity, right? And as was mentioned in the introductory remarks, right? We, to employ the language of Christianity in a particular moment, conjures a particular force which reflects the degree to which the religious right and Christian conservatism has dominated the sort of public framing of the conversation, so much so that when one says Christianity, right, we tend to immediately move to an image of the religious right, which, right, is not the full historical record, but gives us a particular vision of Christianity that would seem to be opposed to the extension of freedom or citizenship, right, as something that's anathema to and opposed to progressive politics. But right, Christianity has, in fact, even in the context of the United States, always been less a singular thing and more a site of contestation, right? From the multiple ways in which the Christianity figures in abolitionist movements and as a justification for slavery, as it remains contested in the context of Jim Crow, right? Employed in an effort to reclaim the Old South. Right, even the language of redemption suggests the legacy of Christianity in the aftermath of Reconstruction's demise, even in the making of Reconstruction's demise, certainly in the modern civil rights movement, as King's letter in a Birmingham jail is written to Christian moderates, right? And then even in the present moment, if we think within the context of the experience of Black Christianity, Senator now Raphael Warnock, trained close by here at Union Theological Seminary, representing one image of Black Christianity alongside the long roster of Black preachers who were enlisted by then President Donald Trump to constitute his advisory committee, representing something that has an odd relationship to that history of the religious right, the way in which Black preachers have also participated on a specific set of terms that we might think about. So that sort of, how do we think about Christianity as this contested terrain that Frederick Douglass, that is, lays out most clearly in that earlier era as sort of drawing a distinction between slaveholding religion or the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, or true Christianity, right? Christianity in service to freedom, if you will. I think the second piece, and here's to think, and I guess perhaps more specifically about the Black religious experience, is the degree to which Black religions, in a general sense, have been imagined as, or have been what we might think of as queered, right? As outside of the norm, if you will, or non-normative, as, right, imagined sites of alterity, right? There's been an argument that, in fact, Black Christianity constitutes its own a different kind of religion. What Black folk have done with Christianity has constituted a different kind of religious practice, whether that's in appeals to emotional embodied expressivity, a sort of freedom that's embodied through worship practices, or as a political discourse that is opposed to the status quo, if you will. But this is also the case clearly with some such phenomena as Black Islams and African-derived religious practices, right? whether it's in a long history that would figure proximity to Africa as all the more a source of alterity, right? And we can think about how this pops up even to the present moment with discussions around Haitian Vodun and what have you. And I know Ronilsa has more to say about this in the context of Brazil and the sort of attention that's given, if you will, to African religious practices. And certainly in something like the Nation of Islam in the context of the United States, where before being recognized as a religion, right, it's considered a game because of the significant amount of folks who convert within the confines of the prison, within the context of mass incarceration, what we now refer to as mass incarceration. So the idea of Black religions as a queered space. And then the third and final thing I will say is also from a different vantage point, and I'll continue to use the language of queer here, not to conflate the category with questions of gender and sexuality, but as a position or posture to the status quo, is the idea that Black religions also constitute a queer space, right, in relation to the norm. And by that, I mean to say that these have been spaces, Black religious spaces within specific traditions and across the traditions, have been spaces that have attempted to affirm the fullness of Black subjectivities in social life, even when social death was the law of the land, right, with regards to Black life. So even the position of affirming Black life might be understood as a queer politic, if you will, right? That these were spaces that cultivated or tried to facilitate a different set of postures, positions, and possibilities with regards to the status quo concerning Black life. And then finally, to think about queer in a more specific sense as it relates to gender and sexuality, that Black churches constitute a complex of what might be seen as, or often what might be seen as contradictory impulses, right? There's a way in which, over the span of the last 40 years, Black churches have figured as almost an amplified and often scapegoat for, right, the prominence of the religious right, especially on matters of gender and sexuality, that Black churches were, if you will, hyper homophobic in a broader climate of American homophobia. And there is certainly phenomena that we need to discuss in more precise ways, but there's also a long tradition of affirming sexual difference within the context of Black communities, even in Black churches, and that calls attention to the ways in which these churches serve a variety of possibilities, both publicly and within the intramural dynamics of Black life. There's a way in which a sort of public performance of orthodoxy, both as it relates to theology, but also as it relates to sexual politics, has often been tied to an intramural affirmation of heterodoxy, right? So even if a public position has comported to what we might think of as a politics of respectability that's so often castigated, that within the confines of those spaces, there has often been a broader embrace of heterodoxy, which is not to romanticize it or affirm it or is outside or in a vacuum from the broader context, but that within those spaces that there has often been a different understanding of than what makes it into the public discourse. So I will stop there. I think I might have gone over just a bit over what my 7-minute goal was, but thank you. And I'll hand it back over to you, Kendall.
Thank you, Professor Surratt. We'll now hear from Ronilson Pacheco.
I thank you. Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you, Professor Kendall and Joseph. I believe this is a great opportunity, an important moment for Brazil and the US to talk about this topic. And so my interest here is to give an overview of the Brazilian context and how it's connected with the United States from the point of view of conservative moment. So I will try to keep timing by reading a short reflection that I would like to contribute to the conversation today. So my idea is that for years, powerful evangelical conservative leaders in Brazil have disputed power and influence about different governments. With Bolsonaro specifically, Jair Bolsonaro, historical evangelical rivals seem to agree with a unique project to strengthen a conservative agenda and to forge a conservative Christian supremacy throughout the Brazilian government. We can reflect UPAN, for example, how in April recently, President Bolsonaro used a convocation for fasting and prayer as a strategy to face the threat of COVID-19 in Brazil. In a virtual meeting, the president and his pastor engaged with the population in order to show that the pandemic had no power, or at least no power larger than God. The biggest evangelical conservative leaders who also own the biggest churches in the country went along with Bolsonaro to challenge not only the pandemic, but also the press and scientists that strongly criticize how the Bolsonaro administration deal with the virus. In contrast, that same group of leaders and evangelical singers had nothing to say about the dramatic situation when Brazil topped 100,000 deaths in August. It's important to point out, for example, that Silas Malafaia, one of the most famous conservative and fundamentalist pastors in Brazil, at the same time that Brazil topped 100,000 deaths for COVID-19, Silas Malafaia shared a post about sexuality, claiming that God made human beings male and female. While Brazil was crying for their dead, the little conservative was think about sexuality. So sexuality is a political issue to be monitored permanently. It seems in all situations in the public square, all dimensions of life in civil society are crossed by dangers of sexuality of people. Nothing seems to be really important to put our lives at risk as a society, since sexuality can be controlled. And what are 200,000 deaths from COVID-19, or the fact, for example, that 75% of the people killed by police in Brazil are Black? To the government, these facts are nothing, because combating the abortion industry, pedophilia, and restricting gay couples from adopting children is more important for the country. So denial of the injustice committed against specific and more vulnerable social groups, in contrast to the strengthening conservative agenda in Brazil, is able to align evangelicals and Catholics without difficulty. In addition, sexuality, family, and religious freedom are demands that connect conservatives and fundamentalists in Brazil and the US. We can consider how the Trump administration was so important to Brazil and its plan to achieve status as a world power among conservative countries. In this sense, Brazil had a special role to fill by taking part in the International Religious Freedom Alliance, along with the United States, Hungary, Poland, and others conservative countries. That organization, more than an international rights movement, was a strategy in which Brazil saw the opportunity to strengthen its name as world reference. Confident in this alliance, or securely under the shadow of the US, Ernesto Araújo, the Foreign Relations Minister of Brazil, challenged all progressive agendas in the world and attacked several countries and international organizations like United Nations and World Health Organization. To Ernesto Araújo, the fight is for family freedom and sovereignty. Nevertheless, the commitment of Minister Araújo to religious freedom shows itself as defense of Christian supremacy and a strong crackdown on opposing views or other faults, even other religions. We can see, for instance, how in Brazil there has been long and intensive persecution against religions of African tradition, like Candomblé and Umbanda, Their persecution highlights the history of strong racism and the denial of Black identity throughout Brazilian. Thus, the fact of making alliance against religious intolerance has not made Brazil a protector of the religions of African tradition and the violations suffered by them. On the contrary, the persecution against those religions has increased, whereas the government, even President Bolsonaro, prefers to speak about Christophobia. In other words, the core of the government or the core of the evangelicals and Catholic fundamentalists in the government believes that there is a global plan to rip out all influence of Christianity in the world, and this includes Brazil. It is necessary to consider that right now, Brazil has at least three important areas of government under the authority of conservative evangelicals: the ministries of education, justice, and human rights are oriented by strong moral agendas. In addition, the aforementioned Minister Ernesto Araújo, a convincing Catholic, makes his ministry an important trench against, in his words, the conspiracy of globalism. Another aspect of the geoparge that is possible to see is this fundamentalist bloc is increasingly active in the field of law. The rise of the current Justice Minister, André Mendonça, his pastor, also means the rise of the National Evangélico of Justice Association, in Portuguese, ANAJURI. This institution in Brazil has the same role as Alliance Defending Freedom here in the US. Actually, ANAJURI is practically one branch of ADF in Brazil. The presence of ANAJURI in the Brazilian Supreme Court, STF, has been growing and the strongest. It is not inappropriate to remember Bolsonaro's words about his indication of naming to occupy a seat in the Supreme Court. Bolsonaro said that he would like to indicate a terribly evangelical name to Supreme Court. Finally, I must draw attention to the fact that conservative movements have different interests. We need to consider that there are at least two different groups surrounding Bolsonaro government. On the one hand, the old group, mostly Pentecostal. There is Baptists as well, but mostly Pentecostal evangelicals, who are seeking power and influence, thinking and digging privileges for their churches and communicational empires. In this group, we have old names like Malafaia de Macedo, Valdomiro Santiago, etc. On the other hand, a group of mostly conservative Calvinists. That group seems to have gotten into power recently, and more important than position and resource, or has a TV channel or government financing. To this group, the more important is to win what they consider a cultural war. Cultural war is important. To them, power and influence for privileges is not the final goal, but to see us all society transformed by the Christian worldview or the mind of Christ. That is why education, culture, and the justice is so important, because that ministries are powerful places to the right and conservative agenda to face the struggle against, for example, the gender ideology. In conclusion, I call attention to this increasingly articulated harmful advance of kind of Bolsonarist Christianity, which has also been called Christofascism, using the expression coined by German theologian Dorothy Zoll. However, interestingly, the progressive field still seems to have difficulties to interpret these signs and to achieve an intelligent alliance with progressive evangelicals in Brazil. who today work in the debate of sexuality, race, gender, housing, public security, and building alternatives toward left. The emphasis of these progressive groups remains on generalization, and prejudice toward the evangelical church sectors. So this is a big challenge and a big struggle to 2022 next election, how the evangelical groups participate of the fight for justice and emancipation and freedom in Brazil.
Thank you both very much. I want to actually intervene not so much disciplinarily as discursively by relying on some language of law. Most specifically, a concept with which both of you are familiar and which has been part of the national narrative, formalized really and enshrined in the constitutional discourse of both countries, namely the notion of separation of church and state, right? Mm-hmm. The U.S. Constitution has been interpreted on the one hand as granting the free exercise of religion, but as forbidding the establishment of religion, which until fairly recently was understood to be an idea whose baseline normatively was something like a firewall between the church and the state. The Constitution of Brazil, in force since 1988, ensures the right to religious freedom and bans the establishment of state churches and any relationship of dependence or alliance of officials with religious leaders, except in some narrowly defined instances that involve collaboration for the public interest as defined and governed by law. And yet, this moment, which Nilsson, you've described as a right-wing moment, seems to me to be a moment in both Brazil and the US in which that consensus, however fragile, that aspirationally the state and the church, government and civil society were separate, right? That consensus is not just under attack, but it seems to me crumbling. And we are living through the dissolution, right, of the distinction between religion and politics in many ways. And it has become, whether framed in the high language of constitutional law by members of the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary, or framed in the language of the low language of moral regulation and culture war. That question of the separation of church and state, that ideological infrastructure that has really been a feature of both countries, seems to me a central one to understand the current moment in which we find ourselves. At the same time, however, religion, social justice movements. We think Raphael Warnock follows in the lineage that goes through Martin King all the way back to the antebellum period, right, in which the understanding of African Americans of citizenship, of rights, and of democratic justice has been complexly plated together, braided with a religious worldview, right, in which the struggle for democracy and citizenship is a struggle informed by the belief that, as liberation theology puts it, God has an option for the oppressed, and that the very idea of justice is connected in the Christian narrative in particular. The very idea of justice is connected, as Anthony Cook has written so brilliantly, to the notion of the beloved community. So that's a dilemma, it seems to me, because the very same religious rhetorics and the language of religion can be put to radically opposed uses by very different religious-based political mobilizations. So how do we think about the question of understanding, naming, and responding to a situation in which this battleground, this terrain of political struggle, draws on different, but in some meaningful sense, connected understandings of the relationship between religion and politics?
I can start. I think three things basically, at least about Brazil. First is about the influence of religion in the moment now. I think is evangelical conservative mostly is so strong, have a strong presence in Brazilian government now, but these evangelical leaders, the evangelical conservative church, that is long time have a presence in the government and the power in Brazil is impossible. We think about dictatorship, for example, in Brazil, without the contribution of religion leaders, in the specific evangelical leaders, several demonstrations and march of Catholic and evangelical support dictatorship. And even with the new constitution in 1988, and years after, have an important contribution of the evangelical leaders to, for example, Sarney government, practically our first president election in a democracy. So these leaders always surround around this power and government, the presence, but this presence is basically was in Congress, representative house in Brazil, but now is they are administration. So the religion always present in the influence the the second thing is, at the same time, it's impossible today think about resistance and fight for justice and the possibility to think about alternative to Brazil without think the role of the church, specifically the church that is present in poor community in Brazil. So this is our biggest dilemma, I believe, is how is possible connect and inspire of influence of the progressive work of evangelical religion, Catholic and evangelical, not only, for example, the role of the liberation theology. We know a lot about that, but have a long contribution of progressive evangelical in Brazil, and many people don't know about that. So the dilemma is possible. Think about other political alternatives in Brazil without think about the role of religion, including African traditional religion, rescue this role of African traditional religion in articulating, mobilizing the Black people, for example. So I think religion is the core in the thing about political in Brazil. So always a strong presence, and now think about alternative is what will be the role of religion, specifically the church in Brazil in the next election, for example, to think possibility to keep and fight justice and human rights in Brazil.
Thank you. Joseph.
Yes, absolutely. So first, I just wanted to say, I was, as much as I was learning from Renilso's opening remarks, I was really struck by the term that came up at the end that you said is emerging there, that refers to this convergence of these different kinds of Christianity within the context of the state as Christo-fascism, I think was the language, which immediately resonated within like recent developments in the United States, but has not been named as such, right? So the language of Christian white supremacy or Christian nationalism has showed up, and folks were very quick to use the language of fascism to think about Trump, but not to connect the Christianity and fascism in the term in the way, and we think of obviously that moment where Trump deploys the military to walk through a protest and then stands in front of a church that he has no affiliation with. And immediately on the internet, images are circling that are likening his posture there to Hitler, right? And so, but to connect the dots in the term, it sort of helped to, I think, make sense of our own context. To Professor Thomas's questions, I guess a couple things I would say, and thinking about like sort of the legal terms that have shaped the conversation in the long history of a professed commitment to separation of church and state and free exercise, right? That these policy laws and policies exist on one hand to sort of protect the government, if you will, from religion, right? From a state religion or a theocracy on some level, right? Thinking about Europe in the backdrop, but also to protect free exercise, right? So while there is a Christian norm, there is a variety of religious practices that are present from the outset that are not affirmed necessarily, but are under a discourse of pluralism, if you will. Free exercise creates that sort of space, and over time, the language that takes on legislation through appeals to religious freedom has historically, was intended to protect religious minorities. Mm-hmm. And so that you see with the rise of the religious right, Christians redeploying that language to protect, the prerogatives and privileges associated with the Christian majority, right? And so to account for the ways in which an appeal to religious freedom in that history is redeployed to protect a place of privilege is a particular thing that I think is worth noting and has to be accounted for. I also want to think, and this is not quite at the level of legislation, but part of one of the things I was trying to get at in my presentation is the ways in which different kinds of Christianity are protected, that I also sort of was hearing in the Renilso's presentation and parsing between a particular kind of Pentecostalism that seeks influence versus these conservative Calvinists that want to enforce a theocracy or Christian worldview. And neither of those frames, which do have, sort of similar developments on the US, allow for the kind of Christianity that Professor Thomas mentioned, which is to say liberation theology, right? Or Black liberation theology as a more particular form. And we can see the way, and I don't know that this is cause for hope or not, but we can see the way, that from almost from the outset, an appeal to locate Obama vis-a-vis Jeremiah, within that tradition was to, cast him as outside the norm. And it almost did derail him, effectively. And, more so even than Obama, Warnock squarely self-identifies with that tradition in very concrete ways, not just through membership and or affiliation through a church. And that strategy was deployed by Kelly Loeffler, and it didn't work this time. Now, I don't know how we think about what has changed or the degree to which maybe the public is getting a greater degree of literacy. I don't know that that's the reason that accounts for the difference, but I also do think, right, it invites space for more attention to think about that progressive vision of Christianity that is also apparent on the ground in the sort of, whether it's the William Barber's moral majority movement or, right, Yvette Flunder's Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, right, which Barber has also been consecrated a bishop within, right, so that forms of Christianity that are seen as outside the norm, that are very important, right, and in many ways are connected to the tradition that is that Union Theological Seminary, where, you know, Renilso is affiliated, and as am I as a visiting professor, is committed to. So if, you know, one might hope that there might be more space under in the years to come for a more robust conversation of where that fits, not just as outside the pale, but as a source for a different kind of politic.
That left progressive tradition. Well, the urgency of it, I think, is underscored by two images that I want to offer to you, which in fact will allow us in the remaining time, and this may be the only other issue we're able to discuss, to burrow down a bit more on this notion of Christo-fascism that Renilson raised, specifically around the question of violence. So I want to offer two images to you. The attacks in Brazil on terreiros, which are the meeting houses of people who are adherents to the two main traditional Afro-Brazilian religions, Candomblé and Umbanda. Right? In 2019, over 100 Afro-Brazilian religious facilities nationwide were attacked by evangelical drug traffickers, right? Evangelical drug traffickers. The second image I want to offer to you is the marauding bands of the Proud Boys who staged what they called a Jericho March in December in Washington, D.C., and engaged in acts of vandalism at two historic African-American Protestant churches, one of which, Joseph, you and I have actually been to, the Metropolitan AME Church, where Frederick Douglass famously and others worship. The other, the Asbury United Methodist Church, where they tore down Black Lives Matter banners. And fortunately, no one was hurt. But there is a tradition as well of assassinations of Black people in their churches. I put to you the tragedy in Charleston a few years ago, where a Black politician was among the people, a Black pastor politician was among the people massacred that day in that weekday Bible study. So let's talk about the question of violence and how that binds race, religion, and politics in our two countries, not around specific political practices or the institution of the state, but by the delegation, if you will, of the respectable right wing, right, of authority to engage in real violence on the bodies of Black and brown people who are marked as outlaws, using in part the symbols, the language, and the ideology of religion, right, to engage in a kind of religious terrorism, right, in the name of, or as through a kind of deputization, an informal deputization, to do so by the state. What are your thoughts about A, how we should think about that, and B, how we should respond to it.
I guess I can go first since I allow you. Right. I mean, there's a number of directions, right? I think I alluded to, early on, part of what, right, we think of the history of white militias, right, that you've just laid out, Kendall, right? The foundation of these organizations in the aftermath of emancipation, right? Christianity, they were understood, right? As these were Christian organizations, the Ku Klux Klan, these white militias,
Right.
and they were only allowed to ride and, if you will, redeem the South after the compromise, right? And the withdrawal of federal troops, right? So it's a tacit consent to allow for them, right? To theologically, right, through violence, reclaim the South, and that the long history of lynching as a ritualistic kind of violence that was as much a rite of socialization and coming of age for white citizens in the South was also, right? When we think about Christian theology, we immediately go to doctrine and dogma, but these sort of, right, rituals that are bounded in American history were, right, our theological positions, right? I think the closest to the popular discourse we go in that regard is thinking of slavery as an original sin, right, or of some sort. But the proactive protection and effort to police the boundaries between what slavery fundamentally set as an ordering racial principle was also, one could argue, a theological doctrine. And so that, I think, persists up till the present day. I had a number of other thoughts but I want to stop there. I'm glad to follow at Renilson.
Renilson.
Sorry.
Fala.
You said about drug trafficker. Evangélico is a big discussion in Brazil about that. If it's possible to use this term evangelical or not. The fact is we have a different scenario today in Brazil, because in the past, mostly this relation with the trafficker and periphery and favelas in Brazil, specifically Rio de Janeiro or São Paulo, but we think about Rio de Janeiro. The relation between the drug trafficker and terreiros, for example, the expression in Portuguese, I don't know how call that in English, but in Portuguese, the idea of the corpo fechado, body closed, corpo fechado, body closed is have a protect of the orixá. So this scenario starts change more or less 1901 or wherever. But the fact is this scenario changing slowly. And the idea is that the church increasingly occupy the several space in favelas, in peripheries, and Rio de Janeiro, for example, or São Paulo, and how several traffickers and how several families and community in the past had the background, the parents is more linked with the terreiros, now had more parents linked with the church, and the small church, small community evangelical church, specifically Pentecostal, along with the idea of the emerged new Pentecostalism, with the idea more violent about demonization against the African religion tradition. This mixed with the time, this mix was created the idea of the space. Jesus is connected with the idea of the victory of authority, and legitimated the action of including the traffic of the fight against the police, and not only the crime, but the fight against the police, injustice against the police, and alternative life in the community. So this is this story, in this context, increasingly was advanced until the idea of, um, I think, is joining with the strong demonization about African religion. And now we have we have in several communities, right, for example, these spaces of Jesus. Jesus is a king of this place. So the trafficker chief is an all of this place. In consequence, Jesus is a king of this place. So it's a big debate about it's possible to say evangelical trafficker because it's have another question. The question is the work of the several church in the prison, for example, and how this work was creating a relationship between pastor and evangelical leaders and the trafficker leaders, and how this relationship was possible became this expression and this action of evangelical drug trafficker. But I think the more important in this background is the races and religions in Brazil. Brazil had a strong racist theological fault, and that has a strong influence in how the African religion tradition is, the imaginary perception about African religion tradition.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have 3 minutes, so I'm going to end on the question of secularism and put it to you in as provocative way as I can. At Congressman John Lewis's funeral, Lawson, the old civil rights warrior, referred to plantation capitalism, right? Something like a constitutive connection between capitalism and racism. In light of what you've just said about Brazil, Nilson, about race and religion in Brazil, we might say that, you know, religion has been both an arena and a tool for the maintenance of what the philosopher Charles Mills calls the racial contract, right? So, what is to be done, right? Is the strategy, we're talking a lot today, less about liberation and more about abolition, right? To what extent will abolition of religion as we know it, like abolition of the police and the prison as we know it, have to become a central agenda of the Black freedom struggle and the reconstruction of Black freedom? And to what extent does that call for a Black humanism, which at the end of the day is incompatible even with the reconstructed religion that centers Black freedom? What do you say to the secularist who says, no, the strategy is not reconstruction of religion, but repudiation and rejection of it if we are to get free, right? How we get free is to reject religion. How do you reply to that? In 30 seconds.
Okay.
Or 1 minute.
My answer so fast. What I believe is a big part of revolution in the world. The Black Revolution had a contribution of the spirituality. So it's difficult to think about fighting for freedom without thinking about the role of religion. We think about Revolta dos Malay revolt in Brazil, revolution in Jamaica, for example, and several revolutions in the US, several revolutions fighting for justice in Africa. And so I think it's a little bit impossible disconnected. The fight for freedom and justice, I think, is so connected to Black people with the spirituality dimension.
Thanks, Nusu. Joseph.
Yeah, I think I would affirm Renilso's response, and I would also say that I would resist the impulse to put religion in a unique category here, because I think often the critique of religion in this way is also sort of a part of a Marxist material critique of culture as epiphenomenal, and right, that in the same way that we ought to take serious how we engage. Certainly there has been, religion has been a vital space on both sides, as I tried to say, and I hate to even use the language of on both sides anymore, as the way it is played in recent years. But I think that it would be more beneficial. My sense is that religion is not the problem itself, and that it would be more beneficial to have a sustained and close and more nuanced engagement with the work that religion does, and how we might have a more critical disposition in engaging it to, right, for those of us, and I think we share that on this call, a vision of a more progressive politics, if you will, how to better resource, to your point around capitalism, right? Because those religions that have lined up on the left have largely been under-resourced, have not controlled the media airwaves in the same way that Christian broadcasting and TBN have. So I think more resourcing and even more nuanced critical engagement with the history and present ways in which religion is a force on the more progressive side of these issues would be my response.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted that we've had an opportunity this afternoon to begin what I'm sure will be a continuing discussion that recognizes the complexities of this tangled, triangulated relationship between race and religion and politics, tries to understand it in a complex way, and to think about fashioning a set of strategies to respond to it. Thanks to our hosts at ELAS. Thank you, Professor Azenya. And thanks to all of you who have participated in this discussion. It's been a real honor for me to be in conversation with you, Professor Soret, and with you, Pastor Pacheco.
Thank you, Professor Thomas.
Thank you. It was
Pastor
a honor
Pacheco.
to me.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor.